The HOA tried to force me into their rules, so I took down the president and rewrote the entire system. They fined me for curtains, hedges, and a mailbox on a house never under HOA control. I showed up with legal proof, exposed the president's lies, and rallied the neighbors she bullied for years. The county ruled in my favor, removed her from power, and ordered restitution. Now the board is reformed, the rules are fair, and I finally sip my coffee in peace on my own damn porch. Ever since I was a kid, I'd imagined myself living in a peaceful neighborhood where the streets were lined with big trees, the lawns were tidy, and the only noise came from birds or maybe the occasional lawnmower on a Saturday morning. After years of grinding it out, saving every penny, and sacrificing vacations and nights out, that dream finally became real. I bought a cozy single-family house tucked away at the very end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The place had everything I'd hoped for, an inviting front garden with just enough space to make it my own, a spacious backyard perfect for barbecues or lazy Sunday afternoons, and a wide porch where I could sit with my morning coffee and just breathe. Best of all, the property wasn't under the thumb of any homeowner association. That was one of the first things I made sure of before buying. I double-checked with my realtor, cross-referenced it with my lawyer, and pored over the paperwork like my future depended on it. Because, honestly, it kind of did. Everything checked out. The house was marked clearly as independent. No HOA nonsense to deal with. Just a peaceful spot to finally settle into the next chapter of my life. The first week felt like a dream. I spent most of my time unpacking, organizing furniture, making quick runs to the hardware store, and introducing myself to the folks who lived nearby. Most seemed friendly, a few just gave polite nods, but overall it felt like a community I could see myself blending into. It was quiet, it was calm, and for a little while, it was everything I wanted. That was until the morning of day 8. I was on the porch, coffee in hand, still wearing my old hoodie and gym shorts, watching the sunlight dance off the dew-covered lawn. That's when I noticed it. An envelope, thick and official-looking, had been slipped under my front door. The bold lettering across the top read Sycamore Valley Homeowners Association. My eyebrows pulled together. I recognized the name from the disclosures I'd read during the home buying process. Not concerned, just curious, I tore it open right there on the porch. The more I read, the more my face twisted in disbelief. According to this letter, I'd already racked up 3 separate violations, one for using curtains that weren't approved, another for overgrown hedges, and the third for violating some sort of mailbox regulation. The total amount in fines? Just over $1,000. I let out a stunned laugh, staring at the paper like it had come from another universe. There had to be a mix-up. My house wasn't part of their HOA. It never had been. Confident it was just a clerical error, I set the letter aside, fully intending to clear it up later. I had no idea that this was just the start of something much bigger. I didn't let the letter ruin my day. I figured it was one of those bureaucratic mistakes that would sort itself out with a quick phone call. So I went back to my business, cleaning out the garage, arranging my tools, figuring out where to hang pictures on bare walls. But something felt off. That same afternoon, while I was out back pulling weeds and trimming the hedges they apparently thought were overgrown, I noticed 2 women I'd seen walking their dogs before slowed down as they passed the front of my house. They didn't wave or say hello like the first time. Instead, they leaned into each other, whispering. I was flicking toward my porch like they were scouting out a crime scene. I brushed it off at first, maybe I was imagining things. But over the next couple of days, it became harder to ignore. A few more neighbors gave me side glances. One woman across the street actually crossed to the other side when she saw me heading out for a jog. The easy friendliness I'd felt during my first few days started drying up like a puddle under the summer sun. Then came Bob. He was the kind of neighbor you could tell had been around forever, gray hair, denim shirt tucked into khakis, the kind of guy who knew the name of everyone's dog and when their lawn got mowed. He stopped by while I was trimming the hedges again, trying to make them look even sharper than the house next door just to stay ahead of the drama. "Hey there," he said with a casual wave, leaning on the fence between our yards. "Welcome to the neighborhood." I couldn't help but notice. "Did you get a letter from the HOA?" I wiped the sweat off my forehead, chuckling dryly. "Yeah, I did. But there's gotta be a mistake. My property isn't even part of the HOA." Bob gave a small laugh, the kind that carries more worry than humor. Good luck convincing Karen of that. I raised an eyebrow. "Karen?" He nodded. "Karen Mullins, president of the HOA. She's been running things around here for 10 years now. Real stickler for the rules, even ones she makes up herself. Doesn't take no very well." That name, Karen Mullins, stuck with me. I remembered it from the letter, signed at the bottom like some kind of decree from royalty. Bob didn't stick around much longer, just gave a knowing look and wished me luck. After he left, I went inside and pulled out the file I kept from the home purchase. Deed, survey, closing documents, everything. I flipped through them, line by line, until I found what I already knew was there. Clear language stating that my property was outside the boundaries of the HOA. I hadn't just assumed it. I had verified it with both my realtor and my lawyer before signing a single thing. I had the paperwork in black and white. Still, the letter and the neighborhood's weird new attitude didn't sit right with me. So I decided to go straight to the source. I picked up the phone and dialed the number on the letter. A woman answered almost instantly. "This is Karen Mullins, president of the Sycamore Valley Homeowners Association. How can I help you?" Her voice was clipped and overly formal, like she was reading from a rule book. "Hi Karen, this is Ethan Clark. I just moved into the house at 245 Sycamore Lane. I got a letter about some fines, but there's been a mistake. My property's not part of the HOA." There was a pause, long enough for me to wonder if the line had gone dead, before she responded with a sharp tone. "Mr. Clark, every property in this neighborhood falls under the association. If you live here, you're subject to our rules. That's how we maintain our standards." My stomach twisted. "With all due respect, that's not accurate. I have the deed. My house was never part of your jurisdiction." Her laugh was light, but carried that smug tone I'd only heard from people who think they're untouchable. The previous owner agreed verbally to abide by the HOA guidelines. That commitment transfers to you. I gritted my teeth. "Karen, verbal agreements don't hold up legally. My documents are clear. I'm not in the HOA, and I won't be paying those fines." Her voice went cold. "We'll see about that." I ended the call and stared at the phone in my hand, already feeling the heat of something I hadn't signed up for. This wasn't just a clerical error. This was something else entirely. The more I thought about that phone call, the more it got under my skin. Karen's smug tone, her flat-out dismissal of my legal documents, the way she spoke like she ruled the whole block, it all felt like a slap in the face. I'd done everything right, double-checked every line before buying this place, made sure I wouldn't be dragged into HOA drama. Yet here I was, being told by a woman I'd never met that her imaginary rules somehow overruled my legal paperwork. I wasn't about to let that slide, so I sat down that night and drafted a formal letter. I attached copies of my deed, the original survey, and the part of my closing documents that clearly outlined the HOA boundaries my property sat outside of. The next morning, I hand-delivered the envelope to the HOA office just a few blocks away. It was in a little brick building next to the community pool, and I handed it to a woman at the front desk who gave me a tight smile and promised to pass it along. I didn't expect an immediate response, but I figured the documents would speak for themselves. I was wrong. By the end of the week, another letter showed up at my door, this one more aggressive, warning me about additional fines if I didn't comply within 7 days. It mentioned my mailbox again, claimed my hedges were still out of spec, and even took another jab at my curtain choice. The real kicker, though, was the thinly veiled threat of legal action. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just some form letter. This was personal. Karen wasn't just misinformed, she was determined. So I picked up the phone again and called the number on the letter, asking to speak with her directly. She answered like she'd been expecting me. "Karen Mullins," she snapped, "president of the Homeowners Association. What can I do for you?" I didn't bother with small talk. "Karen, this is Ethan Clark, 245 Sycamore Lane. We spoke last week. I delivered documents to your office proving that my house is not under HOA jurisdiction, but I just received another letter, this time threatening legal action. I'm not sure what game you're playing, but I'm not going to keep tolerating this." Her response was instant and full of ice. "Mr. Clark, every home in this neighborhood is part of the HOA. If you think you're some kind of exception, I assure you, you're not. We have standards here, and you're expected to meet them just like everyone else." I gripped the phone tighter. "I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just asking you to acknowledge the legal documentation that clearly shows my property is exempt." She laughed again, that same condescending chuckle. "Look, I don't care what your papers say. The previous owner agreed to follow our rules. That agreement carries over. You live here now, so you're one of us whether you like it or not." My jaw clenched. "Karen, a verbal agreement doesn't override a legal one. You know that." I'm not part of the HOA, and I will not be paying any fines or changing my property to fit your preferences. If you continue pushing this, I'll be forced to pursue legal action for harassment." Her voice hardened. "You do what you think you need to do, Mr. Clark." But I don't back down. I ended the call, staring at the wall in disbelief. This wasn't just stubbornness, it was pure control. She didn't care about the law, the paperwork, or fairness. She wanted obedience, plain and simple. And I had a sinking feeling she wasn't planning to stop anytime soon. After that second call with Karen, I knew this wasn't something I could just talk my way out of. It wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a full-on power trip, and I'd been marked as the enemy. So I did what any sane person would do when dealing with someone who doesn't respect boundaries. I got everything in writing and prepared for the long haul. I printed extra copies of my deed, my title report, the HOA boundary map, and the email from the previous owner confirming they'd never agreed to join the association. I compiled it all into a folder and sent it via certified mail to the HOA office, so they couldn't claim they didn't receive it. I also kept receipts and a delivery confirmation, just in case this turned into something bigger. I wasn't trying to make waves, I just wanted to be left alone in the house I worked years to afford. But Karen didn't see it that way. Within days of sending the documents, I noticed a shift in the neighborhood. Neighbors who used to wave started pretending they didn't see me. Conversation stopped when I walked by. I even caught a couple of people peeking through their blinds when I stepped out to mow the lawn. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just in my head, but then I saw the bulletin board. Right outside the community center, in plain view for anyone walking by, was a printed notice from the HOA titled, "Non-Compliant Homeowners Jeopardizing Neighborhood Standards." It didn't list my name, but it described violations that matched mine word for word: curtains, mailbox, hedges. And everyone knew I was the new guy. The message was clear. I've been publicly labeled as the neighborhood troublemaker. Karen was painting me as the problem. That's when I decided I needed help. I reached out to a local attorney, Susan Myers, who specialized in real estate and HOA disputes. She had this calm, no-nonsense attitude that instantly made me feel like I wasn't losing my mind. During our first meeting, I laid everything out, every letter, every email, every photo. She reviewed the documents and leaned back in her chair with a sigh. "Your property is clearly excluded from the HOA," she said. "Everything Karen's doing is harassment, and she has no legal authority to enforce anything on you." She told me to start gathering as much evidence as I could: photos of my hedges and mailbox, screenshots of emails, records of phone calls, anything that showed I was following local codes even if I wasn't following Karen's made-up rules. So that's what I did. I documented everything, took close-up shots of the mailbox that matched the standard issue in the county, measured the hedge height and compared it to local ordinance guidelines. Snapped photos of the curtains from the street to show they weren't anything offensive or out of line. I even printed out the email from the previous homeowner stating in black and white that they had never agreed to any HOA regulations. Meanwhile, Karen kept escalating. More flyers showed up around the neighborhood. More notices appeared on my door, each one more aggressive than the last. She was trying to wear me down, to force me into compliance by turning the entire community against me. But I wasn't backing down. If she wanted a war, I was ready to fight, legally, calmly, and with every scrap of proof I could get my hands on. At that point, I knew private conversations weren't going to cut it. Karen wasn't just ignoring the truth, she was rewriting it and selling her version to the whole neighborhood. If I stayed quiet, I'd only make it easier for her. So when I saw the notice about the upcoming HOA meeting pinned to the same community board where she'd posted her smear campaign, I made up my mind. I was going, not to cause trouble, but to make things clear, publicly, and on record. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday evening at the local community center. I spent the weekend getting ready like it was a trial. I printed multiple copies of my deed, the HOA boundary map, my correspondence with the attorney, and the email from the previous owner. I even bought a small voice recorder and tested it twice to make sure it worked. I wasn't leaving anything to chance. When Tuesday rolled around, I showed up early and took a seat near the back. The room was filled with about 24 people, all sitting in rows of metal folding chairs. Some were chatting quietly with neighbors, others stared straight ahead like they were bracing for drama. Karen stood at the front near a podium, flipping through papers with this air of authority like she was the mayor of a small town. She was dressed like she was heading into court, tailored blazer, neatly pinned hair, and a little gold badge that read HOA President. I could feel the eyes on me when I walked in. A few people looked away quickly, others just stared. But there were also a couple of quiet nods, neighbors who didn't say anything out loud but were clearly paying attention. The meeting started right on time. Karen called the room to order and began rattling off updates about landscaping contracts, block party planning, and scheduled street maintenance. My issue wasn't even mentioned until the very end, like an afterthought. That's when she cleared her throat and said, "Now, onto the matter of ongoing non-compliance by one homeowner who has unfortunately refused to cooperate with the association standards." She never said my name, but everyone in the room turned their heads toward me. Her voice was smooth, but laced with condescension. Despite repeated attempts to resolve the issue amicably, this homeowner continues to ignore the rules that protect the quality and value of our neighborhood. That was it for me. I raised my hand. Karen glanced at it and hesitated, clearly hoping I wouldn't speak, but a low murmur from the crowd made it impossible for her to ignore. "Mr. Clark," she said through a tight smile, "you have 2 minutes." I stood up with my folder in one hand and my recorder in the other. "Thank you, Karen," I said, keeping my tone calm but steady. "I'm here tonight because what's happening is not just unfair, it's completely outside the law. My property, 245 Sycamore Lane, is not, and has never been, part of the HOA. I have the deed, county records, and legal documentation to prove it." I held up the papers for everyone to see. "This isn't about non-compliance. It's about jurisdiction. Karen doesn't have the authority to enforce anything on my property." Karen tried to cut in, but I kept going. "Furthermore, I have written confirmation from the previous owner stating they never opted into the HOA. There was no verbal agreement, and even if there had been, verbal agreements don't override legal documents." The room had gone quiet. A couple of people leaned forward in their chairs. One older man in the front row muttered, "Well, he's got a point." Karen straightened up and interrupted again, her voice louder this time. "Mr. Clark, we've already addressed this. The previous owner verbally agreed to comply, and those expectations continue under the current homeowner." I looked her dead in the eye. "You know that's not legally binding. You've ignored proof, posted misleading notices, and publicly tried to shame me into compliance. That's not enforcement, that's harassment." The tension in the room was thick. I saw people exchanging glances, some of them looking at Karen with uncertainty now. She slammed the gavel down. "This meeting is not the place for personal attacks," she barked, trying to regain control. "Then what is it the place for?" I asked, raising my voice just enough to be heard. "Because if I'm being publicly accused, I have the right to defend myself. And frankly, so does anyone else in this room who's ever been fined or threatened without explanation." A murmur swept through the crowd. I could see something shift. People were listening now, really listening. Karen slammed her gavel again. "That's enough, Mr. Clark. Your time is up." I nodded, gathering my papers. "Thanks for letting me speak. I'll see you in court." And with that, I walked out. A few people followed me out into the parking lot. One woman patted my shoulder and whispered, "It's about time someone said something." Another guy nodded and said, "She's been pulling this stuff for years." I didn't say much, just thanked them and headed home. But I knew right then that something had changed. Karen's grip on the neighborhood wasn't as ironclad as she thought, and I had just cracked the surface. If I thought Karen was going to back off after the meeting, I was dead wrong. Within 24 hours, she made it crystal clear that she wasn't just doubling down, she was going all in. The next morning, I walked outside and found a bright red notice pinned to my front door with heavy-duty tape. At the top, in huge block letters, it read, "Final warning, immediate compliance required." Below that was a list of the same ridiculous demands she'd been hounding me with: repaint the mailbox in HOA-approved colors, replace my curtains with neutral tones, trim my hedges down to exactly 3 feet. Even though they were already within county guidelines. But this time, there was something new. In bold print near the bottom, it threatened that if I didn't comply within 14 days, the HOA would seek a lien against my property. A lien on a home that wasn't even under their control. I stood there on my porch, notice in hand, heart pounding not from fear, but from pure anger. This wasn't oversight anymore. This was targeted harassment. I stormed back inside and called my attorney, Susan Myers. As always, her voice was calm, grounded, steady. "She can't do that," Susan said plainly. "Not legally. She has no jurisdiction, and she definitely can't place a lien on your property. But this isn't just aggressive anymore, it's harassment. I think it's time we escalate on our end." I agreed without hesitation. That same day, Susan drafted a formal demand letter addressed to the HOA, specifically naming Karen. The letter outlined every documented attempt Karen had made to enforce rules on a non-member property, included copies of all the evidence we had so far, and warned that continued harassment could result in legal action for defamation and abuse of power. It was sharp, professional, and left no room for misinterpretation. I also submitted a full report to the county office that oversees HOA operations, including scanned copies of every notice, photo evidence, and a statement describing everything I'd experienced since moving in. While Susan handled the legal side, I turned my attention to something just as important: talking to my neighbors. After the HOA meeting, a few people had started warming up to me again. Some waved when I passed. A couple nodded with quiet sympathy. I figured if Karen had gone after me this hard, I couldn't be the first. So I started asking around. I approached people gently, one-on-one, and what I learned honestly blew me away. Emma, a single mom down the street, told me she'd been fined for putting up Christmas decorations 2 days early. Tom, an elderly retiree who'd lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, said he'd replaced his mailbox 3 times in a single year because Karen didn't like the color. Another couple showed me a photo of a violation notice Karen had slapped on their fence for having their trash bins visible for less than an hour. They weren't just rumors, these were real stories. And one by one, people began to speak up. With their permission, I started documenting their testimonies, recording statements, saving texts and emails. I compiled everything into a folder that kept growing by the day. The more I learned, the clearer it became that Karen wasn't just misusing her position, she'd been weaponizing it for years. She used fear and intimidation to keep people quiet, to control the narrative, to punish anyone who didn't fall in line. But the tide was turning. People were tired. They just needed someone to speak up first. Now that someone had, they were ready to talk. And with every new story I collected, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just fighting for my peace anymore. I was fighting for all of us. The shift came quietly, not with fireworks or headlines, but with an email from the county office. It landed in my inbox late one afternoon with the subject line "Formal Notice of HOA Investigation, Sycamore Valley." I opened it with a strange mix of hope and anxiety. The message confirmed that based on my complaint and the evidence I'd submitted, the county had officially launched an investigation into Karen Mullins and the Sycamore Valley Homeowners Association. They requested additional documentation, witness statements, and anything else that could help establish a pattern of behavior. I replied within the hour, attaching everything: photos, letters, audio files, testimonies from neighbors, even the flyers Karen had plastered around the neighborhood labeling me a threat to community standards. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone beyond the reach of Karen's influence was finally paying attention. Around the same time, something subtle but meaningful started happening on the street. The cold shoulders, the tight-lipped glances, they began to fade. Neighbors who had once avoided me now stopped to chat. Some apologized for staying quiet. Others simply said thank you in that way people do when words fall short. Emma brought over homemade cookies and offered to speak to the county investigators. Tom invited me over for coffee and reminisced about how peaceful the neighborhood had been before the HOA got out of hand. People who'd once kept their heads down were now willing to speak up, and more than that, they were willing to stand beside me. Karen, on the other hand, was unraveling. At the next HOA meeting, she came in swinging. Her speech was frantic, defensive, and dripping with blame. She accused me of spreading misinformation, of organizing a neighborhood rebellion, of trying to dismantle everything the association had worked so hard to build. She even brought a lawyer with her, a stiff guy in a cheap suit who tried to argue that Karen had every right to enforce rules on any property within visual range of the HOA's domain. But this time, she wasn't the only one speaking. When she tried to move on without giving me a chance to respond, the room pushed back. Hands shot up. Voices called out. Let him talk. We deserve to hear both sides. He has the documents, we've seen them. When I finally stood to speak, I laid it all out. Calmly, without raising my voice, I went through every piece of proof I had. The original deed, the HOA boundary map, the written confirmation from the previous owner, the legal opinion from my attorney, the findings of the county's preliminary review. I passed copies around the room. Karen tried to interrupt, but this time, no one listened to her. Even some of the board members, people who had stood by her for years, looked visibly uncomfortable. A few lowered their heads. Others flipped through the documents with furrowed brows, clearly seeing things they'd never bothered to check before. By the time I finished, the room was dead quiet. Then someone clapped. Slowly, a few others joined in. It wasn't thunderous applause, but it was enough to know something had changed. Karen didn't say a word. She just gathered her papers, mumbled something to the lawyer, and left before the meeting ended. That was the night she lost control, not just of the room, but of the narrative she'd been crafting for years. For the first time, people stopped seeing me as the troublemaker and started seeing the truth. The dam had cracked, and there was no stopping the water now. The official ruling came just 2 weeks later, though it felt like a lifetime. A certified letter from the county arrived in my mailbox, thick with documents and stamped with the seal of the Department of Neighborhood Affairs. I opened it slowly, half expecting another curveball, but what I read made me sit down right there on the porch with a sigh of disbelief and relief. The county's investigation had concluded that Karen Mullins and the Sycamore Valley Homeowners Association had overstepped their legal authority on multiple counts. The ruling stated plainly that my property was not, and had never been, under the HOA's jurisdiction. Every fine, every notice, every threat they had issued was null and void. But it didn't stop there. The county ordered the HOA to pay restitution for the harassment and legal expenses I'd incurred during the ordeal. And perhaps most shocking of all, Karen Mullins was formally removed from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. Word spread fast. By the next morning, neighbors were stopping by just to say congratulations or shake my hand. Some offered quiet apologies for not believing me sooner. Emma and Tom showed up with coffee and a small handwritten note that simply read, "You did it." Even the ones who had stayed neutral seemed relieved, like a pressure valve had finally been released. For the first time since I moved in, the neighborhood felt like a community again. Without Karen breathing down their necks, people started talking freely about what had happened, about what needed to change, about how they didn't want this kind of thing to ever happen again. The HOA, now leaderless and badly shaken, called for an emergency meeting to figure out what came next. I showed up, not as a target, but as a neighbor ready to help fix what had been broken. The board looked different, meek, humbled, unsure. Mark, a quiet man who had mostly stayed out of Karen's way before, stepped in as interim president. He didn't come with arrogance or orders, just an open notebook and a simple message. "We know the HOA hasn't been working. We're here to listen." And for once, they did. The room was filled with ideas. Some folks wanted to dissolve the HOA entirely. Others, like me, believed it could still serve a purpose if it was restructured and kept in check. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it short. "We don't need control," I said. "We need clarity, fairness, and accountability. This community deserves better than what it's had." That speech led to the formation of a reform committee, and to my surprise, several neighbors nominated me to be on it. I didn't want a leadership title, but I agreed to help for a while, at least. Over the next few weeks, we met regularly and rewrote the bylaws from the ground up. We added clauses that limited the HOA's power, demanded full transparency in meetings and finances, and most importantly, clearly defined which properties were included and which were not. No more gray areas. No more loopholes for power-hungry people to exploit. One of the most important additions, the one I pushed hardest for, was a clause that protected homeowners like me, ensuring that no one outside HOA boundaries could ever again be fined, harassed, or intimidated into submission. The new bylaws passed with overwhelming support, and the next HOA election brought in a fresh board of residents who genuinely wanted to serve, not control. I didn't run, and I didn't want to. I was happy to step back and let others take it from there. But I stayed involved as an advisor, someone people could turn to if things ever started going sideways again. I didn't just want to fight. I helped rebuild something better. Something that, for the first time, truly reflected the people who lived here. And that, more than any ruling or letter or courtroom victory, felt like the real win. With Karen gone and the new bylaws in place, the entire atmosphere on Sycamore Lane began to shift. The tension that had once hung over the neighborhood like a low fog started to lift, replaced by cautious optimism and a strange but welcome quiet. People who had once avoided eye contact now stopped to chat while walking their dogs or watering their lawns. For the first time, it felt like everyone was breathing the same air, free of fear, free of power plays, just neighbors trying to move forward. The transformation wasn't overnight, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. And somehow, I found myself in the middle of it. Even though I hadn't planned on stepping into any kind of leadership role, the community kept pulling me in. People would ask for advice on navigating HOA questions, invite me to committee meetings, or drop off old records asking if I could help sort them out. At first, I resisted. I wasn't looking to become the new Karen. Just someone who had wanted to be left alone and ended up in a war he didn't start. But the truth was, things needed guidance, at least for a little while. So I agreed to help in an unofficial, temporary capacity. I joined the first few meetings with the new board, helped explain the revised bylaws to confused homeowners, and even mediated a dispute about fence height between two neighbors who hadn't spoken in months. Slowly but surely, things started working the way they were supposed to. To my surprise, even some of Karen's former supporters began to come around. Not all at once, and not with open arms, but in their own quiet ways. One woman who had previously crossed the street to avoid me now waved from her front yard and complimented my landscaping. A man who once echoed Karen's talking points sent me an email thanking me for helping his elderly mother get a waiver for a small garden shed Karen had previously tried to have torn down. It wasn't about winning people over. It was about showing them what it looked like when rules were fair, clear, and grounded in respect rather than fear. The committee's work continued for several months, and I stayed involved just long enough to make sure the foundation was solid. We hosted community Q&A nights, published easy-to-read guides about residents' rights and responsibilities, and even launched a monthly newsletter to keep people informed without the usual legalese. Eventually, others stepped up, people with fresh ideas and open minds who wanted to build something better, not cling to old grudges. And that's when I knew it was time to take a step back. The neighborhood no longer needed someone to fight its battles. It needed people who could maintain the peace. I passed the baton without ceremony, content to return to my porch, my garden, and the quiet life I'd originally come here for. But the neighborhood was different now, more connected, more thoughtful, more resilient. What had once been a collection of tightly wound individuals was starting to look and feel like a real community. And while I never wanted the spotlight, I understood that sometimes the role you end up playing isn't the one you planned for. It's the one that needed to be filled in the moment. And when that moment passes, the greatest success is knowing you can finally let go and just live. Just when I thought the dust had finally settled and life on Sycamore Lane was finding its rhythm again, the past came knocking, one last time. It was a bright, quiet morning when I opened my mailbox and found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, cold and clinical in its wording. Karen Mullins was suing me for defamation. I stood there frozen on the front steps, rereading the letter, my stomach tightening with each line. According to her claim, the things I'd said during HOA meetings, in emails, and even in conversations with neighbors had damaged her reputation and forced her to move from the community. The irony was rich. Karen had been the architect of her own downfall, but now she was trying to pin the blame on me. I called Susan Myers immediately, and after one look at the paperwork, she let out a sharp sigh. "This is textbook slap," she said, "strategic lawsuit against public participation. She's not trying to win. She's trying to shut you up and punish you for standing your ground." Susan was calm, confident, and more importantly, fully prepared. She got to work immediately, filing a motion to dismiss and compiling the same airtight evidence we'd used to shut down Karen's HOA campaign. Testimonies from neighbors, the county's formal ruling, the documented harassment, it all went back into the file. Only this time it wasn't just about HOA boundaries. This was about truth. The court hearing took place a few weeks later, and I showed up wearing the same suit I'd worn to my house closing. I sat quietly as Karen's lawyer tried to twist my statements into personal attacks, suggesting I had waged a campaign to humiliate her. But the judge wasn't buying it. He reviewed the documents, listened to Susan's precise and measured argument, and saw the reality for what it was. Karen's claims weren't just weak, they were baseless. Every statement I'd made had been backed by evidence, most of it publicly recorded or confirmed by legal authorities. It took less than an hour for the judge to rule in our favor. The case was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she couldn't file again. And just to drive the point home, the court ordered her to cover my legal fees. Walking out of the courthouse, I didn't feel triumphant or angry. I just felt done, like the final page had turned, and I could finally close the book. Back on Sycamore Lane, life picked up where it had left off. The board meetings went on without drama. Neighbors stopped by just to chat instead of complain, and little by little, the strange tension that had once defined this place disappeared. I spent my evenings back on the porch with a cup of coffee, waving to kids riding by on bikes, sharing tomatoes from my garden with Emma, and helping Tom with his bird feeder when he couldn't reach it anymore. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Emma and Tom showed up with a small wooden plaque. It was simple, smooth, with black lettering carved into the front, for standing up for what's right. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, my throat tight, and shook both their hands. I hadn't asked for recognition, but knowing the people around me truly understood what we'd been through meant more than any legal win. That night, as I sat alone under the porch light, listening to the soft hum of crickets and the sound of neighbors laughing down the street, I finally felt what I'd come here searching for. Peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because I knew I had helped make it better. In the end, my story wasn't just about property lines or HOA rules. It was about standing your ground when someone tries to push you over it. About finding strength you didn't know you had when the odds felt stacked. And most of all, it was about discovering the kind of community that doesn't just live next door, but stands beside you when it counts. For me, that was the greatest victory of all.